On to the government's plans to privatise parts of the probation service. It wants to bring private firms and charities into taking over low and medium risk offenders, with the probation service looking after high risk people. Well, this week the heads of the Derbyshire and Leicestershire Probation Trust said the government should wait for more research before introducing the changes, and next week probation officers will strike over the plans. Tim Parker's been to Leicester to hear their concerns.
Hello there.
Hello,
nice to meet you. Hello. Probation officers here are so concerned about plans for privatisation that they're threatening strike action. They want Justice Secretary Chris Grayling to delay plans for changes.
The bottom line here is that we are being privatised in order that Mr Grayling can line the pockets of his friends who will make an immoral profit out of the misery of crime.
These private companies are not in it for public protection, they're in it to make a profit, and that is something that doesn't sit right with me or my colleagues.
You're worried about the speed of these changes, aren't you?
He's been told, left, right and centre, that these plans compromise the future of the management of offenders in this country and therefore compromise public safety. He understands that that's the case, but he chooses to ignore that advice.
We've come to a point now where we feel we're not being heard, and this is the only way forward.
Are we seriously concerned about issues of public protection? Well, if that scares people, I don't want people to be scared, but what I do want is for them to treat the issues that we have raised with utmost concern, because this is a very serious issue.
Probation workers in Leicester there telling us why they're so concerned, but the government insists its plans will reform a system that's been failing for years. The issue was debated in the Commons this week. The Justice Secretary told the House the reforms were vital to improve dire figures on the number of prisoners who reoffend.
Crime in Britain today, Madam Deputy Speaker, is falling, which is good. There are fewer first-time criminals out there, which is also good. But increasingly, crime in Britain today is being committed by people who have offended before, who are going round and round and round the system. Reoffending in Britain today has barely changed in a decade. It has risen again in the last year. It is as high as it was 5 years ago when the trusts were formed, when the reforms were put in place. Just yesterday, we released statistics that paint a grim picture of reoffending in this country.
Well, joining us to discuss all of that is Jane Lofhagen from the Lincolnshire National Association of Probation Officers. Welcome, Jane. Something's got to be done to cut reoffending rates. They've barely changed in the last decade.
Well, Chris Grayling and the Conservatives always highlight this issue of reoffending, but the group of offenders that they're referring to are prisoners serving under 12 months. And they introduced this whole TR programme on the basis that this particular group of offenders were reoffending very highly. And that's true, but that's the only group of people with whom the probation service doesn't work. So it's not an argument for changing the probation service. It's an argument for changing the law so that short-term prisoners are subject to licences. We work with ex-offenders released from prison on licence very effectively and very efficiently. And the probation service is a high-performing public service. It goes under the radar. Not very many people know what we do, but against all the government's own standards, we are a very high-performing service.
OK, so what are your main concerns? Because what your union's saying sounds rather alarmist. It's saying that lives are at risk. Is it really that serious?
I'm afraid it is, yes, and we don't want to be alarmist. But the way it works at the moment, people are subject to quite a comprehensive and work-intensive risk assessment programme, and all kinds of aspects of risk are assessed. So you don't get somebody who is medium risk, you don't get somebody who's low risk, and you don't get somebody who's high risk, because there are 4 or 5 different aspects of risk to assess. And once you have come up with an assessment, say, of medium risk of reoffending or of high risk of harm, that changes because it's dependent on whether they're using substances, whether they're in mental health treatment, whether their relationship's broken down, whether they're getting family support, whether they're subject to restrictions on their licences or on their orders, and will often change through all these arbitrary factors during the programme.
OK, well, Toby, you spoke during that debate on Wednesday. What are your concerns about this?
Well, I think that whether these reforms are going to work or not is entirely unproven. I think that the probation service, as Jane was saying, has got every single probation trust is either good or outstanding. And what the Minister was unable to explain to us in the debate on Wednesday was why the desire to extend probation services to those of shorter sentences had to coincide with privatisation. Why not go with the probation service to have that extension? And if you're going to go for this huge change, which is potentially so serious, why not have pilots that actually show whether or not it works? When Chris Grayling got this job, he cancelled the pilots, but then introduced the policy, which seems, absolutely crazy.
So what's the rush with all this, Pauline?
Well, because it hasn't been working, and the low-grade offenders, and they're not going to be dealing with the high-grade offenders. They're still will be dealt with by the probation service. So we're looking at the lower grade offenders that it's not working with, so we need to make it work, because people out there do not want people to come out of prison and reoffend and cause them problems. And it is a problem to the general public.
Sounds sensible, doesn't it?
Well, it would do, but if you're talking about the lowest grade offenders, the lowest grade offenders don't work with the probation service at all. Within the remit, we only start with people who need an input.
In which case we need
intervention.
something. We need something to stop those low grade offenders reoffending, because the public don't want people to keep reoffending. They want them sorting out, and that's what this new service should do.
But the union's only asking for a delay to this, not to scrap the whole plan. Am I right?
The union is against privatisation of a public service because at the moment, where we work, we are dedicated public servants, and resources and intensive work programmes follow risk. If the service is privatised and there's a primary agenda that takes over from that, then services will follow where the money is. For instance, it will be much easier to get your payments by results with the very lowest grade offenders who are unlikely to reoffend anyway.
So which part of the privatisation are you worried about? Sorry, Pauline.
We're worried about all of it. The probation service is a very high achieving service, and it is reducing reoffending. And Pauline's right, people do want reoffending to be reduced, but there isn't a magic fix to that. It's a painstaking, complicated and difficult process. And the lowest grade offenders that Pauline's talking about do not include minor offenders.
Why such radical reform then?
Yeah.
Because we need to change things, we need to get it right. And as I've said before, the public expect us to get it right, and we need to get on with it. The more we delay everything, the less chance are we. It's going to take longer to get right.
Are you listening to the concerns out there, though, about this too? The head of the Derbyshire Probation Trust is also against this, saying that there could be more preventable attacks and deaths. She's not mincing her words there. This is strong
Why are there going
stuff.
to be deaths? The people that are the high-grade offenders will not be dealt with by anybody other than the probation service.
The important thing on this is that the people who will stay with this new national probation service will be those at high risk of causing harm. But medium-grade offenders, serial thieves, people who've been 3 or 4 times into prison already, would be precisely people that would actually disappear from these. Derbyshire Probation Trust, a high-performing authority, will completely disappear. And many of the kinds of work that they do, particularly in rural communities, will simply cease to happen.
There is a categorisation called serious further offences, and whenever somebody who is subject to our supervision commits a serious further offence, there's an inquiry about it. And most serious further offences come from low and medium risk offenders. And these are the people who will be subject to supervision by the private sector. These are people we won't have any monitoring over.
Key question is why not actually do the pilot, and then if the pilot works, then make your changes. But why make the changes before the pilot?
There will be some of the probation service who will go into these new services so that the expertise won't be lost to the system. It'll just be a different way of doing it. And sometimes you have to stop, look at a system and decide maybe there's a better way of doing it. I accept that the probation service is a good service, but I think sometimes you need to reassess and look again and say, can we do it a better way?
Well, you said
and can
you're
we solve
concerned
it?
about deaths. Why would people die?
Yes.
Well, let me give you an example. If somebody is being released from prison, from open conditions, somebody serving quite a long prison sentence, they can't be put into open conditions until they're medium risk. Then they get released at medium risk. So they would be the kind of person who would go into the private sector.
Okay.
But why would they kill somebody?
Well, they might have done that before. all lifers would come into that group.
Eventually.
So, for example, well, they would be medium risk at the point of release. They're not released unless they are. That's the whole point with indeterminate and lifers prisoners.
Very briefly,
the most dangerous
is striking
offenders.
the answer, though, Jane?
No.
Striking is a desperate measure so that people understand what it is the government are doing to a public service that works tirelessly to protect the public every single
Jane.
day.
But they
Thank you
are
very much. We'll have to
listening.
leave it there.
They are
Thank you.